Two teenage girls vanish from a quiet Leicestershire village, and a killer's trail seems to vanish with them. Then science steps in with a weapon no one fully trusted: DNA profiling. A dragnet swirls to life, sweeping through thousands of local men until one tiny genetic clue binds a name to the crime. The suspect looks ordinary, the evidence feels almost impossible to ignore, and the dawn of forensic genetics is born in a rural quietness that will never be the same. This is Catching Colin Pitchfork, the first time DNA would catch a killer, turning a rural tragedy into a turning point for policing and a new era of truth-seeking. The location, the victims, and their background. In the rolling countryside of Leicestershire, two quiet villages sit companionably along the edges of Leicester's urban pulse: Narborough, a place where hedgerows become boundaries between homes, and Enderby, a neighbor with a slightly more industrial heartbeat. It's 1983, and the country is still feeling the aftershocks of change, economic uncertainties, shifting social norms, a media culture that loves a story of ordinary people touched by extraordinary crime. If you stood on the village green at dusk, you'd hear the far-off hum of a city and the closer, intimate sounds of a life lived in small, predictable rhythms. The school bell, a church bell, a bus coughing along a country lane, the creak of a back door as someone steps out to check the evening air. Two teenage girls from these close-knit pockets of England would become the focal point of a case that would test a nation's faith in safety, and then, in an almost revolutionary way, in science itself. Lynda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, names that will echo through the annals of forensics, were not just statistics. They were daughters, friends, classmates, the kind of people who remind a town why it keeps its doors unlocked at night and why the future feels both bright and fragile. Their lives followed the familiar arc of adolescence: school routines, friendships, shy flirtations, plans for weekends, the small dramas that knit a community together. Their backgrounds weren't dramatic in the sensational sense. They were ordinary in the way that makes their loss so piercing. The mothers who kissed them goodnight, the fathers who drove them to dance practice or football matches, the siblings who teased and teased back. In short, life as it's lived in the safer parts of a country that still believes in the possibility of safety. The first murder in this narrative would arrive in a way that makes you doubt you're still in a quiet corner of rural England. Lynda Mann's disappearance in the autumn of 1983 would be a shock to a village that believed in predictable days and predictable endings. Dawn Ashworth's life, a few years later, would be touched by a similar darkness in a nearby street of Enderby. The two cases would come to define a region's fear and its hope, a paradox that becomes the engine of a story about evidence, justice, and change. The landscape around Narborough and Enderby, fields that catch the sun at certain angles, lanes that bend into views of distant hills, a railway line that threads the countryside with a whisper of trains, reads as if designed for normalcy. It's exactly this normalcy that makes what happened feel almost impossible. A crime that would force the public to confront the unsettling possibility that danger can step across a doorstep, carrying a shape you can't quite recognize until it's too late. The social fabric in 1980s rural England adds another layer to the drama. Neighbors look out for one another, but in a world where television news travels fast and tabloid headlines travel faster, a small community can feel the weight of scrutiny, rumor, and speculation. The police officers serving Leicestershire carry the burdens of a force tasked with protecting a landscape of farms, churches, and schoolhouses while also managing the pressures of a media environment that wants an answer yesterday. The town librarian, the shopkeeper, the bus driver became co-authors of a story they didn't anticipate telling. The culture around crime and punishment is changing too. Forensic science has not yet become the omnipresent tool it would be in later decades, but the seeds of that revolution are already being planted. The idea that science could unlock a killer's identity, almost as a moral act of restoration, is beginning to take hold in police labs and university research rooms. The victim's daylight lives offer a counterpoint to the night's fear. Lynda Mann, with her own circle of friends and school routines, is someone you might pass on in the street and never notice, except that in her case, noticing is suddenly a way to remember. Dawn Ashworth sits in a similar orbit of school, family, and the small rituals that shape a teenager's week: homework, phone calls, a walk to meet a friend, the familiar sounds of a neighborhood trying to be safe. Their stories, though separate in time and place, overlap in a shared reality, a life that could be ordinary and bright, cut short by something unthinkable. The heartbreak ripples outward, through families who cling to a sense of memory, through schools that implement new safety measures, through local papers that try to tell a story without sensationalizing it. Then comes the scientific dawn that would eventually redefine how crimes are solved. In the early 1980s, DNA profiling is a new, astonishing tool, one that promises something more than circumstantial inference. It's a technique in which a person's unique genetic code can be used as a person's signature. It has the potential to turn a long, wavering search into a precise match, binding a suspect to a crime in a way that previous forensics could only dream of. Yet with this promise comes a cascade of questions. How dependable is this new science? What are the ethical implications of a dragnet that swabs thousands of local men in a close-knit community? How will families, victims, and communities respond to being treated as a potential genetic pool to be sifted through in the hunt for a killer? The crime itself. The countryside around Narborough and Enderby feels like a place where you could set your watch by the hum of tractors, the distant chime of a church bell, the soft rustle of hedgerows at dusk. Then, in the autumn of 1983, the rhythm fractures. Lynda Mann, a bright, ordinary girl with a future that seemed to stretch ahead like a sunlit road, vanishes on the edge of a village street. Her friends describe her as the kind of person who pressed play on a record just a little too loud, laughed a little too freely, and kept a pocket full of plans for the weekend ahead. That weekend never arrives for her family. The walk home from a friend's house ends in a silence so heavy you can hear it in your own breath. The village, which had learned how to read the weather in hedges and farm lanes, reads something darker into the night, a shadow that doesn't belong there. Lynda's disappearance is the first thread pulled from a tight-knit fabric. The search parties move through familiar routes, the cut-throughs behind the primary school, the lane that bends toward a field where cows stand still and watch the road, the thicket that locals cross without a second thought on their way to church or market. It's not just a missing child, it's a crisis of trust. Neighbors who unlock their doors at dusk now double-check their windows. The mothers who tucked their own children into bed the night before becoming investigators of their own fear, weighing every stranger's silhouette against the memory of Lynda's smile. By the time Lynda's body is found, the village has learned a brutal lesson about the gap between safety and tragedy. The hedgerows, once a picturesque boundary, become a map of the crime's reach. The evidence is stubbornly sparse. A few footprints in damp earth, a fallen leaf crushed into powder on a path, a scrap of fabric snagged on a bramble, enough to raise questions, but not enough to write a clear account of what happened in those final minutes. The public appetite for answers grows faster than the investigation can, and the rumor mill, never silent in small towns, begins to churn a theory from fragments and fear. 3 years later, Enderby wakes to a similar echo. Dawn Ashworth, a girl whose life held the same ordinary contours as Lynda's, school, friends, a quiet sense of belonging, disappears from a nearby street. The familiar routes reappear, the way Dawn walked home from the bus stop, the brief conversations with friends that felt like harmless gossip, the small rituals that anchor a teenager's day. Her body later surfaces in a hedgerow, not far from the last place a young girl might be lured into a world she doesn't yet understand. The image of Dawn's life, its brightness, its potential, its ordinary nights spent talking on a phone in the kitchen, becomes a contrast to the surreal horror of a crime committed in daylight on a night that could pass without anyone noticing. The second murder doesn't merely repeat the first, it intensifies it. Now the region isn't just grieving for two separate daughters, it's grieving for a pattern it can't quite explain, a shadow that insists the danger might be closer to home than anyone wants to admit. 2 murders, 2 neighbors, 2 cradle-to-campus lives cut short, and one devastating question. Could the same hand have been responsible for both? The investigators chart the geography of the crimes with a careful, almost methodical, patience. Each hedgerow becomes a potential clue, every passing car, a possible witness. A stray boot print in the dust becomes a line on a map that could connect 2 separate nights into a single chronology. But the clues are stubborn and widely dispersed. There's no single smoking gun, no dramatic confession, no CCTV footage, no DNA to point the way. What exists instead is a growing tension between what investigators hope to prove and what the growing public insists on must be proven. The community demands certainty in a form that science has yet to provide, and the police, true to their duty, press forward with a caution that sometimes feels like quiet stubbornness in the face of fear. As the 1980s progress, the notion that these deaths are random acts fades. The two murders begin to look not like two isolated crises but like a single strain of danger that they has learned to move through a particular countryside, exploiting quiet routines and the trust of a close-knit population. The acts themselves, deliberate, isolated, seemingly routine in their execution, carry a disturbing choreography: an encounter at night, a promise of companionship or help, a sudden, violent strike, and a body left in a place that would, under ordinary circumstances, be associated with a peaceful walk home. The victims' lives, Lynda Mann's, Don Ashworth's, start to be understood not just as a loss to families, but as a call to a culture that believes in safety, squarely tested by a crime that refuses to be easily categorized. The public's emotional weather shifts in tandem with the science of the era. DNA profiling is not yet a household word, but the seeds of a forensic revolution have been planted. The idea that a human being's genetic code could serve as a unique fingerprint promises resolution where traditional investigation has proven slow or inconclusive. Yet such promise comes with heavy questions. Will thousands of men be treated as suspects in a dragnet? What does it mean for a rural, tightly knit community to be reduced to a pool of potential genetic profiles? What happens to the families when the search, so personal and intimate, begins to resemble scientific testing? These aren't hypothetical worries in Narborough and Enderby. They are immediate, visceral concerns that shape every conversation, every press conference, every whispered rumor at the corner shop. In the weeks and months that follow, the two crimes become more than just a headline. They become a turning point in British policing and popular understanding of science. The investigation will push boundaries of privacy, of civil liberty, of what a community is willing to endure in the name of safety. The victims' families, who would later become symbols of resilience and advocacy, carry the weight of public memory with a quiet dignity that does not seek vengeance but demands accountability, that the search for truth not consume the living, that the memory of Lynda and Dawn not be used as fodder for fear, and that the science that promises certainty be applied with caution, humility, and respect for those who have already paid the price of that pursuit. The investigation process: clues, suspects, red herrings, breakthroughs. This step threads together the stubborn ordinary and the radical science that would redefine policing. It follows the slow burn from cold trails and cautious tips to a revolution in how crimes could be solved. The Narborough and Enderby murders didn't yield a smoking gun, but they did yield a new kind of question. What if the truth could be found not just in footprints and alibis, but in a person's DNA? Clues that forced a closer look. The geographic throughline. Both disappearances occurred in a tight rural arc: two villages, a patchwork of hedgerows, a school, a church, and a few back lanes where a walker might be mistaken for a neighbor. The proximity of the crime scenes suggested a local offender, someone who knew the rhythms of the area, not a traveling stranger. The victim portraits. Lynda Mann and Don Ashworth were ordinary in the most human sense: students, part-time workers, family-focused, with ordinary friendships and routines. The familiarity of their lives made the crimes feel personal to a community that believed safety lived in the predictability of everyday patterns. The evidentiary gaps. There was little in the way of clear physical evidence. No eyewitnesses, no CCTV, no obvious weapon. What existed were small, stubborn traces: footprints in damp earth, a piece of fabric snagged in a hedge, and the unsettling sense that someone had studied the routes these girls took home from school or friends' houses. The emerging science. DNA profiling was entering the police lexicon as a powerful, controversial instrument. It offered a promise. Could a genetic signature tether a killer to a crime in a way that eyewitness testimony and circumstantial clues could not? The idea was intoxicating and terrifying for a community used to solving crimes with old-school methods. The pressure cooker of public memory. Media attention turned two small villages into a laboratory of fear and expectation. The public wanted resolution, the police wanted a method robust enough to withstand scrutiny, and scientists wanted to see if DNA could be the missing hinge. Suspects, red herrings, and the long shadow of motive. A bevy of local men. Investigators cast a wide net across Narborough, Enderby, and neighboring hamlets. The pool included school acquaintances, neighbors who had briefly seen the girls, tradesmen who worked in the area, and men with prior concerns in their personal histories. In a small community, almost anyone could become a suspect by virtue of proximity to the crime. The red herrings. Rumors piggybacked on fear. A neighbor with a murky past, a car seen at dusk along a lonely lane, a request for a friend's whereabouts that night, a misread gesture that could be interpreted as something darker under pressure. These leads were often compelling in the moment but fragile under scrutiny, illustrating how fear can magnetize weak signals into plausible narratives. The ethical edge. The idea of a DNA dragnet, swabbing thousands of local men to assemble a pool for comparison, raised profound questions. Could the scale of genetic scanning erode civil liberties in the name of safety? Would a community accept the premise that many are suspects until proven innocent, simply because science offers a better chance at truth? Breakthroughs, misdirections, and the turning points. The birth of the DNA approach. Alec Jeffreys and his team at the University of Leicester developed a method to create a DNA profile from small, difficult samples. The possibility of linking two cold cases through a single genetic signature felt like science fiction becoming policy. The police began to design a dragnet. Thousands of local men would submit voluntary DNA samples for comparison against semen or tissue vapors from the crime scenes. The dragnet as a social experiment. 60 to 80% of eligible men in the area were persuaded to participate, reflecting both the trust and the fear of living under a high-stakes, scientifically framed investigation. The process tested the community's tolerance for privacy erosion, while simultaneously building a data backbone for a future conviction. The first medical and procedural breakthroughs. Even before a suspect was named, the DNA testing produced a new kind of map, the genetic landscape of a population connected to two brutal acts. The lab's ability to generate reliable profiles from degraded samples, and to compare them against a large registry, created what many officers described as a moving target that could be refined with each additional sample. The shifting sands of motive. Investigators wrestled with why a local man would commit such acts. A mix of opportunity, a motive that wasn't purely sexual, and the possibility that someone who believed themselves immune to capture might still be drawn into the web of a high-profile, high-stakes investigation. The social psychology of a small town under unprecedented scrutiny became part of the case file. The human dimension in the lab and the field. In the field, detectives faced the emotional weight of families, the pressure from media, and the moral challenge of asking a whole community to participate in a potentially invasive, life-changing process. In the lab, scientists faced the opposite pressure, turning fragile, sometimes contaminated samples into robust data that could stand up in court. The science that changed the game, and the people it touched. The dragnet becomes a courtroom instrument. The DNA dragnet wasn't only about catching a killer, it was about redefining how evidence could be gathered and evaluated. The process forced prosecutors to grapple with statistical reasoning, population genetics, and the limits of what a genetic match could prove in terms of guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The ethical and social ripple effects. The case raised questions about consent, data storage, and the long-term implications of genetic databases. For communities like Narborough and Enderby, the experience left a lasting imprint. Trust in policing, trust in science, and trust in the idea that truth could emerge from a crowd of anonymous samples rather than from a single luck-filled clue. The quiet resilience of families and the rise of advocacy. Families of the victims learned to translate grief into public advocacy, demanding safeguards, oversight, and clear communication about how the DNA process was used and how results would be presented. Their voices helped shape later debates about forensic science and civil liberties, long after the initial shock had faded. Twists, revelations, and the road to a breakthrough. A long, patient search. The investigation didn't leap from dead ends to a single discovery. It moved in incremental steps, refining DNA analysis methods, narrowing the suspect pool with statistical thresholds, and waiting for a result that could withstand cross-examination in court. The decisive moment. A particular genetic profile emerged that matched both crime scene samples. The laboratory's confidence, combined with the strength of the cross-checks and the suspect's proximity to the crime scenes, created a bridge from scientific possibility to prosecutable fact. The sting of public interest. The moment information leaked to the press was almost as potent as the breakthrough itself. The public's appetite for certainty collided with the legal system's need to protect rights and ensure a fair process. The media narrative around DNA testing shaped how the case would be understood by jurors, judges, and the wider public. The human costs and the turning point for policing. The successful identification and conviction of the perpetrator affirmed the value of new science in policing, but it also reminded the public that technology is a tool with limits, not a magic wand. The community's fear transformed into a cautious optimism that science could deliver justice, without erasing the need for rigorous procedure and compassionate policing. Resolution and legacy. The aftermath, sentencing, and the forensic revolution. Opening. The verdict that echoed beyond the walls. The moment of verdict. Colin Pitchfork is found guilty on 2 counts of murder in connection with the Narborough murders. The weight in the room shifts from tense accusation to a slow, exhausting relief laced with the recognition that this outcome, however imperfect, would become a benchmark in modern policing. The judge imposes life imprisonment with a minimum term, signaling that some crimes demand a sanction long enough to reflect the gravity of the harm done and the public's demand for certainty. The immediate aftershocks. Families, investigators, and a nation processing the news move through a spectrum of emotions, vindication tempered by sorrow, relief tempered by a sense of how far science has yet to go in understanding every motive and nuance of a crime. For the 2 victim families, the verdict doesn't erase the memory of their daughters. It legitimizes a painful search for justice that continues in memory, advocacy, and public awareness. The courtroom's science, the public's trust. DNA as the hinge. The Pitchfork case cements DNA profiling as a practical, court-acceptable form of evidence, though never as a flawless oracle. The trial demonstrates that genetic signatures, analyzed with rigorous statistics, can tilt the scale toward guilt when supported by a robust chain of custody, reproducible results, and transparent interpretation. It's a moment when a scientific method becomes a legal instrument, not a guarantee. Statistical realism and the limits of certainty. The defense had challenged the strength of the DNA link and the interpretation of probability. The court's acceptance of DNA evidence rested on careful statistical framing. Probability that a random person from the population shares the same DNA pattern is vanishingly small, but not zero. The narrative emphasizes that DNA is powerful, yet it must be contextualized within a full evidentiary mosaic. The people behind the science. Alec Jeffreys and the Leicester team. The scientists who pioneered DNA profiling become household names in the annals of policing. Their work did more than solve 2 murders. It established a model for modern forensic science, a disciplined lab culture, careful sample handling, and a willingness to stand up in court to explain a method in plain language. The detectives and prosecutors. The investigators who shepherded a radical idea from lab bench to courtroom faced not just technical hurdles but the weight of public expectation. The prosecutors had to translate complex genetic data into a narrative that jurors could understand without oversimplifying, balancing the science with human stakes. The community's evolving conscience. Narborough and Enderby, forever touched by the era, confront a new normal, a town where the door-to-door trust that defined rural life must now coexist with an acknowledgement that genetic information can shape public safety. The case spawns advocacy around consent, data storage, and safeguards for future generations. The broader impact: policing, forensics, and policy. The rise of the DNA revolution. The Pitchfork verdict accelerates the adoption of DNA profiling worldwide. Laboratories expand capabilities. Police forces begin standardizing collection, handling, and interpretation protocols, and courts develop clearer standards for how genetic evidence is presented and weighed. The National DNA Database and Governance. The case helps propel the creation of national DNA databases and the legal frameworks governing them. Debates about privacy, civil liberties, and the scope of surveillance intensify, shaping policy for years to come. The story becomes a cautionary tale about balancing public safety with individual rights, an ongoing conversation in every subsequent major forensic breakthrough. Ethics, trust, and memory. Families who drove advocacy choose to elevate ethical oversight, clearer consent, transparent data practices, independent review, and stronger channels for public communication about how DNA evidence is used. The narrative of two murdered girls becomes a catalyst for communities to demand accountability, not just speed, in modern justice. Legacy in the courtroom and in culture. The template for future cases. The Pitchfork case becomes a blueprint, realistic in its recognition of DNA's power, humble in its acknowledgement of scientific limits, and dramatic in its courtroom storytelling. It teaches juries and judges to listen to experts without surrendering to them and to ground scientific claims in rigorous evidence. The cultural drumbeat. Media, policymakers, and the public begin to frame forensic science as a legitimate component of the justice system rather than a silver bullet. The story informs future debates about privacy, data retention, and the ethics of mass genetic screening in high-profile cases. A lasting reminder. The victims' legacies endure, not as mere victims of a sensational crime, but as catalysts for progress in science and policy. The two girls' lives become touchstones in a broader conversation about safeguarding communities while expanding the tools we use to protect them.